Hey guys, welcome to Next Step Airsoft. Today I'm going to be installing bearings, a new cylinder, head, nozzle, piston, and piston head into this version 3 gearbox. And right now I'm going to put the bearings in. These are 7mm bearings, so if your gun is shooting anything above like 430, you probably need to have bushings in, because 7mm bearings are not made for that much stress. So I'm going to put a little bit of epoxy on the shell here because I don't want these bushings to wobble out. Then I'm just going to take the rag and wipe off the extra. Then I'm going to repeat that for all 6. Okay, so I've glued them all in, and I've also wiped the back side. I don't want any glue to get in the bearings because that could actually glue them together and turn it into a bushing, which is I'm taking the bushings out, so I don't want bushings in there. So the advantage of bearings is that it runs smoother and quieter. But if you, like I said, have high FPS, then you really don't want bearings because these small bearings are not made for that much stress of high FPS. You really want to stay with bushings or get a gearbox shell that has a much larger hole. There's 8 and 9mm bearings that you can get if you have a shell that's made for those, and you can put much higher stress on those bigger bearings. Okay, so the next thing I'm going to do is going to be installing the new parts I have for compression. Now this is the old piston and piston head, and the new one I have is right here. This is all metal, and I'm going to be correcting the angle of engagement, and I've sanded this down so that it's flat because it stuck out a little bit before. This one is the old one it came with, and the gun is old and this is old, and I don't know if you can see that in there. You can actually see light through the seal that this has. This one is so good that it can actually like push itself back out. So this is going to be a much better seal. I'll get higher FPS and more range with better seal. Now the piston head or cylinder head that I'm using here is a dual O-ring, and it's silent. I bought these together and they're made to be silent, and I'm not sure exactly how silent that is, but I will be doing a shoot test and I will show you guys how silent it is. Now the nozzle I'm using here is double O-ring aluminum nozzle, so it's going to be strong and it's going to give me a good air seal. And the piston, like I said, is all metal, and I'm going to be grinding out some of these teeth and correcting the angle of engagement so that it's perfect and I'm running really smooth. Okay, so the teeth come in this rack for the piston, and if you look online you'll see some people say that this has slid out on them or that someone they know. So I'm going to be gluing it in to make sure that that doesn't happen to me. Okay, so I'm just going to put a little bit right on the edge here. It doesn't need a whole lot. Now I'm just going to slide it in. You want to make sure it's all the way in, because if that sticks out then it can actually cock your piston head, which could lead to air seal problems. Now it's not as important to get all the glue out of this as it is the bearings, but we still want to do a good job getting as much as we can. Alright, now the piston head I have here is, like I said, a silent piston head, and it has these bearings on here. This is for the spring to rotate on so that when it gets pushed back and forth and everything, it can turn freely and do whatever it wants. And one thing also I've done to this spring is sanded down the end of it so that it's smooth. This is just a standard spring, but I've sanded it smooth so that the end of this can't get jammed anywhere and cause a bunch of damage to the airsoft gearbox. Alright, so now I'm going to put everything that goes inside the piston, which is the screw, this little shoulder spacer, and the whole bearing set up here. I'm going to put it all on my screwdriver and push it up and through and try to get it into through this hole, but that's easier said than done. Okay, so here we go. Now I'm just going to screw this in. You want to make sure that's real tight so it's not cocked or doesn't eventually come off while you're firing your gun. So this is the new piston and piston head I'm going to be using, and this is the old one. You can see it just looks better, and it's going to perform much better for me. Now this is the original cylinder. There's not much fancy about these, and as long as you're not going to a bore up setup where it's actually bigger, then there's no reason to replace this. Okay, so now I'm going to put the nozzle onto the piston head, and then this is called the tappet plate, and it just kind of like locks onto the nozzle there. And then now I slide the cylinder onto the cylinder head, and it all just kind of locks in. And there we go. Now I'm going to slide my piston and piston head in. You want to be careful not to mess up this O-ring that's on the piston. There we go. And there, now I have a much better compression line than the old system that was very leaky. Okay, so now I'm going to show you guys how to correct the angle of engagement on a gearbox. So what that is I don't know if you can see it very well there, but this gear is called the sector gear, and the piston aren't lined up exactly properly. It's just a little bit cocked, and it doesn't go quite straight. And actually, when the gear turns around to pull the piston back, it either has to push the piston out of the way, which won't happen when the top is on it and keeping this straight, or it has to grab the next gear, which it's not made to do that. This gear, second gear, is not strong enough to pull this spring back repeatedly. That's why this last gear is stronger. It's made for that. So what we have to do is grind out most of this first gear, and then we also have to put a small spacer up here against the piston head and in between the piston, so that it will move the last tooth of the piston just a little bit back. And I'll show you what it looks like when it's done. Okay, so here we go. Now, I don't know if you can see this, but there's a small gap in there. That's where the washer that I put in there is. And now my angle of engagement is just about perfect. And I'm going to reinstall this so I can show you here. When the gear comes around, it doesn't hit any of the previous gears. It comes and it's right smooth. Just comes right in perfect contact with the last and the biggest gear on the piston. Then when I turn this, it just brings them all back. And then, as normally, it would slip, and this would go shooting forward, and then continue, and the angle is just about perfect. Alright, so that wraps it up for this video. I'm going to be shimming the gears and doing a reassembly video. You can see those in my channel. Click over down there. Please remember to subscribe and comment on what you would have done differently.